way development was understood was that because countries like Australia and the United States had gone through their process of development, yes, it had taken decades, centuries, however long you want to sort of think through, that because we understood that process, that, how a country or a society modernises, that it could be done more quickly, that if we've sort of cracked that code.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. This year marks a remarkable milestone in our region's history. It's the 50th anniversary of Papua New Guinea's independence. On the 16th of September 1975, the Australian flag was lowered in Port Moresby and Papua New Guinea, or PNG, embarked on the challenging but vital journey of nationhood. For Australia, this was a moment freighted with pride, responsibility, and no small degree of ambivalence. We had administered, under the trusteeship arrangements, Papua New Guinea for decades. We were charged not only with its control, but an obligation to prepare a people for self-government. This pathway to independence wasn't straightforward and it wasn't rapid. From the upheavals of the Second World War and Eddie Ward's so-called New Deal for PNG, through to Paul Hasluck's painstakingly slow program of social and economic development, to the Whitlam government's eventual decision to hasten independence, the Australian approach reflected a mixture of paternalism, altruism, and geopolitics, of course. Development, understood in the Menzies era as a transformative process of education, agricultural improvement and social mobility and uplift, was central to how Australia conceived of its regional role. Yet, there have been debates over whether this vision produced meaningful outcomes or whether the pace and nature of change in PNG doomed such efforts to fall short. So, to help us grapple with these questions surrounding Australia's trusteeship of PNG and the ideas of development that guided it and the legacies, positive and negative, that still shape our region half a century after independence, I'm joined today by Dr. Nicholas Ferns, who is an ARC DECRA Research Fellow in History at Monash University. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Nick.
Thanks, Georgina. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on, and just from down the road too at Monash, so nice to have a short little journey, but to have an in-person guest, I always love. So I think for our Afternoon Light audience, it would be really useful to start our discussion with the Second World War and where we were in the world in terms of Australia as an independent nation, been through Federation in 1901, and where we stood vis-a-vis the territories around us that had been under occupation or British colonial rule. And of course, we're still in the sort of final days of empire at this time too. Yeah. Not just British Empire, there were other empires as well. So paint us a picture of what the region looked like and Australia's place in it. So
it's a good question, good place to start. So the Second World War, we'll start with Papua New Guinea, which was where quite a bit of fighting took place during the Second World War. What is current-day PNG was actually two separate territories or colonies, however you want to sort of describe them, although I suppose there are technical legal differences there. There was what is currently the southern half of PNG was Papua, which was an Australian colony. It was part of Australia, technically, which it obtained from the British in the early 1900s. I think 1906 was when the Papua Act was passed. But the northern half was the League of Nations Mandate territory of New Guinea, which was a former German colony until the First World War. And then at the Treaty of Versailles, the peace conference in Paris at the end of the First World War, the League of Nations took all of the former German colonies in the Pacific and Africa and sort of doled them out to the countries that won the First World War. Australia campaigned hard to get New Guinea, which it then administered after the Second World War, effectively in union with Papua. So there's a legal sort of difference between the two places, even up till the 1970s, but they are effectively both administered as Australian colonies. So that's sort of that part. What is current-day Indonesia was a Dutch territory at that time. And then if you move into the Pacific, you've got British colonies such as the Solomon Islands. Fiji was a British colony still at the time. Samoa was Western Samoa, or was a New Zealand mandate territory. It became a trust territory after that. America had sort of interests in parts of Samoa. Japan had mandate territories in the Pacific, which of course was important during the Second World War because that was sort of used there And then in Southeast Asia, there were British colonies and French. British colonies such as Malaya and Singapore, of course, but the French also had Indochina. So this is an area where Australia and New Zealand are really the only kind of two independent, and I'm using scare quotes there, I suppose, independent places, and the rest are European colonies in various sort of forms. Yeah.
And in the post-World War II period, what was the response of the Indigenous people of New Guinea? I mean, was this accepted as just, part of what they should come to expect? There'd been a German colony up to World War II. There'd been part of an Australian colony since early 1900s. Yeah. I mean, was this just sort of uncontroversial, or was there independence movement starting then?
Various viewpoints. So the other part is, of course, large parts of New Guinea were occupied by the Japanese during the Second World War, and there was a lot of American troops that came through. And I mean, the response of local New Guineans was very diverse. I've got countless stories. A couple that sort of come to mind, I think, speak to the question. One was there was a story of a local New Guinean that had multiple hats, and he would look outside in the morning and see who was winning in the battle, and he'd put on the Japanese hat or an Australian hat. And I guess that sort of reflects a perspective that these are outsiders that have come into a place. And I think it would be another key point there is I think it's easy to overstate how pervasive Australian control was in parts of New Guinea. Up until the 1950s and 1960s, there were large parts that were not really exposed to Australian rule. And so as a result of that, there was a perception of outsiders, but I don't think it was necessarily a moment of opening their eyes to, now we can govern ourselves or anything like that. I think there was still a perception amongst many New Guineans that, yes, these people were outsiders and their purpose there was, varied, sometimes mysterious. One of the other experiences of New Guineans during the war was of meeting African-American soldiers who would come and fight in New Guinea, and that was very eye-opening because of the racialised, obviously, underpinnings of colonialism. And so Japanese occupiers, African-American soldiers that were not being told what to do by Australian, kind of colonial officers and so on. That, I think, played an important role that may not have had an immediate effect, but I think it definitely over the years after the Second World War, into the 50s, 60s and 70s. And this is not just a New Guinean story, this is a global story that started to undermine that kind of natural claim that a lot of European, colonial leaders had that there was a right or an expectation of colonial rule. I think that moment was pivotal in starting to undo some of those sorts of assumptions. Absolutely.
So the United Nations Charter establishes this trusteeship council, and there's the international trusteeship system, which I think winds up in the 90s once all the trustee countries become independent nations. What was Australia's view at the time setting this up? I mean, was the Australian government determined that we would have control as a trustee of Nauru and New Guinea? Was that a real sort of sense of these are our territories, we should have them, we have interest in them?
Yes.
Or was it placed upon us as an obligation given we were in the region we were in and someone needed to fill that trusteeship role?
It's a little bit of both in some ways. That's the classic historian answer. But I think the more active interest goes back, like I said, to the end of the First World War. And I guess to explain to listeners, the trusteeship system is a sort of direct almost, pretty much a direct kind of transfer from the League of Nations system into the UN system. And I can talk more about that if you've got questions. But Billy Hughes at the end of the First World War was very sort of active. He was like, we must have New Guinea for our own, sort of strategic interests. They wanted Nauru for economic interests. Nauru had large phosphate deposits, which was very useful for
huge
Australian
bird
farms.
poo.
Yep. A lot of Nauru is now, was used to farm Australia until today in some ways. So that was the real push then. And I think that at the immediate end of the Second World War, that assumption hadn't completely gone away. I don't think it was as strongly put as
so there was a sense that New Guinea is a buffer zone for
Buffer
Australia.
zone, it had, so there's a buffer zone in terms of invasion, so that was a big part of it. That the fighting, put in crude terms, the fighting took place in New Guinea rather than in northern Queensland or something like this was the assumption. I think historians have looked at Japanese plans and said it was very unlikely that they were going to make their way to Australia, but we do have hindsight to look at that. So that was a big part of that, and that assumption never really went away. And I think you could still argue that there are still defence, geopolitical, thoughts today about the
Oh,
sort of
100%.
role of
Yes.
the Pacific Island
course.
chain and all that. So
concerns
that's always
about
been part of it.
Chinese bases being
100%.
set up in Papua New Guinea and being used to then be a launch pad for attacks on Australia.
And so
We're
that
still
assumption,
worried.
yes, that assumption that this is our strategic zone, Australia's strategic zone, was a big part of the UN system. One interesting part of you asked about the moment, that there was H.V. Evatt, who represented Australia at the UN, the San Francisco conference that set up the UN.
And was the External Affairs Minister.
Yes, External Affairs Minister under Chifley and Curtin. He actually, with the New Zealand sort of equivalent, made a brief effort to open up all colonies to this trusteeship system. So the key difference was that the trusteeship system, every year, Australians and whoever controlled a territory had to report to the UN and say, this is what we're doing, which was not a usual practice in colonial sort of contexts. And you'll be shocked to hear that the British and the French put down that idea that they would have to report to the UN about all of their colonies and all of that sort of thing. But it's an interesting moment. I think that Australia sort of saw value in this kind of international oversight towards what Australia was doing in these places. And so I think there's that as well as the kind of self-interested side. I think there was a belief that, colonialism could be done in a way that was internationally acceptable and so on. And, Australia believed in that.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, and we will obviously get on to PNG, which is, of course, the major focus of today's discussion. But, it's interesting, Nauru declares its independence 7 years before, 7.5 years before New Guinea does, on the 31st of January 1968. I mean, why was Nauru ahead of New Guinea? Was that because of the individuals, their own leadership there, or was it considered we'd done what we needed to do in Nauru and they were more ready for independence?
It's a very good question. I think so. It was to do with the local population there. That there was a stronger. Well, I guess part of it is Nauru is much smaller, much smaller. It's one of the smallest countries in the world, and so the population was at the time between 5,000 and 10,000, I think thereabouts. Whereas in PNG it was into the millions with 800 different languages being spoken. So the challenges of nationhood in PNG were perceived by Australia as being quite different. If anything, the Australians thought Nauru was too small to become a viable nation state. They actually proposed to move the entire population to Fraser Island at some point, which fell through because of white Australia policy and assimilationist kind of things. The Nauruans felt they wouldn't be able to hold on. That point is relevant in the context that Australia actually didn't want Nauru to become independent as quickly as it did, partly because it would mean relinquishing control over the phosphate mines. So there was a much more self-interested sort of aspect in the Nauru story. And so the reason why they felt able to become independent was that immediately upon becoming independent, the Nauru population, or Nauru, became one of the richest countries in the world by per capita income because of the phosphate royalties that would come in.
I remember the Nauru building in I think near Collins Street in the city in Melbourne. It's still there, isn't it? Yeah.
At one point it was the tallest building in Melbourne, I think.
Yeah, and quite a sort of luxurious building, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it was said, was it the Nauru government? I'm going to get this wrong.
It was
owned it, and it was sort of on the riches of yes, that's right, and on the riches of phosphate.
That's right. Yeah. And some of the investments did not go quite to plan, and so as a result, Nauru is no longer one of the richest countries in the world, which is its own story. But that wealth was something that Nauru had that PNG did not have. And I think that was one of the big differences there in the sort of timeline and so on. Yeah.
So the main goal of this international trusteeship system that Australia was part of as a trustee of Nauru and New Guinea was to promote the advancement of the inhabitants of trust territories and their progressive development towards self-government or independence. And that's from the UN's website. Yeah. Obviously historical part of the website now because it's been decommissioned. How did the Australian government undertake this? I mean, they had a Minister for Territories, which was Northern Territory, but also these trust territories. I mean, what was the approach? And we're of course really largely talking Menzies era now.
Yes. Yeah. So the approach there, and I guess the underpinning of that idea of advancement and preparing for self-government was partly a product of earlier ideological kind of attitudes that colonialism should not just be this stark exploitative sort of thing, that there needed to be a improvement of the welfare of the local population. And so that was taken seriously by the Australian government, that there was an annual requirement to report, and the Trusteeship Council within the UN would ask questions of often a representative of both the Territories Department based in Canberra, but also the Papua New Guinea administration. Sometimes a Nauruan representative went, but it was far more often for the PNG representative. Anyway, the point there was that the people questioning the Australian government were both countries that had colonial territories themselves, so the other administrating or ministering countries such as France and Britain, they had trust territories in Africa. They would be part of it, but it was also the Soviet Union was part of this organisation, parts of, I think, it was often an Indian representative. So anti-colonial sort of representatives, I guess, is the point there. And
so
they
anti-Western,
anti-Western, anti-colonial, and non-aligned, yes. So they would grill the Australians quite often.
So there was a level of antagonism 100%. There.
And it became quite cliche. The Soviets would say the same things over and over again, which was a clear tactic, on the Soviet part. But nevertheless, the Australians had to respond seriously to those claims. And so they would have to demonstrate we've spent X millions of pounds on education, on agricultural development. And so they did that. They had every year after the Second World War, the grant that the Commonwealth government would give to the administration in PNG would go up to the point where it was, tens of millions of dollars by the 60s. And that was, yes, to fund schools, to build roads, to, this is development 101. This is building infrastructure. It's trying to develop export industry. So they tried to, at times they would try getting coffee industry going in Papua New Guinea with mixed results, things like that. And so they would do that, and then they would have to write a report and say, this is what we've been doing, and they'd do that each year. So there was a degree of, I guess, buy-in, you might call it, on the part of the Commonwealth government, the Menzies government at the time, but also this was a international-facing kind of administration. So they were aware that if they perhaps, slid in their actions, they would get called out on that.
So Paul Hasluck, of course, is the famous and very long-serving Minister for Territories. So he's pivotal here. I mean, Australia is obviously, attending these UN meetings. It's influenced by the questions that's being asked, the expectations of the Trusteeship Council, but it had its own conception of what development meant. And you've got geopolitical concerns, of course, that are there. But, what was Hasluck and others, what were they thinking development when it came to New Guinea and, of course, Nauru as well was all about?
Yes. So it's a really good question because, while the UN had oversight, there was not a UN sort of model for what development had to look like. It was left wide open.
Because this is really quite new, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, before that, you had empires and colonies.
Yeah.
And so, how the empires would look after their colonial territories was different up to them. And, let's be honest, no one was asking questions except maybe the local population who said this is really bad or this is great. But now we have this sort of concept of development.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. And I mean, that does have colonial roots. I think that's part of what my book argues is that prior to the Second World War and that particularly the British example, that there's sort of an idea that emerges in the first half of the 20th century amongst British colonial officials that recognise that it's unsustainable to just be strictly exploiting the local population and so on. And so you get this notion of there being kind of two purposes of colonial rule. One of them is to obviously provide resources that benefit the empire. So there is still that exploitative element. But the price that the imperial power, the British in this case, have to pay is to promote the welfare of the local population. And the trusteeship system sort of borrows from that. And Australia borrows from that as well. Australia is a loyal member of the British Empire at this time. And they look at what the British are doing in places like Kenya or what have you, even parts of the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and sort of draw examples from that. But the point is that it's about building up a society that is both politically stable. This was a big part of the Hasluck vision, was that there shouldn't be an emergence of an elite that was sort of seen in a British example as providing instability in some ways. That one of the phenomena that people at Hasluck noticed was that in, say, parts like Ghana or a place like that, there were some of the earliest African colonies to get their independence. There was a political elite that was very nationalist, very anti-colonial, that pushed for independence, and for someone like Hasluck, it happened probably faster than he would have liked. And so rather than, creating a university immediately, it would start with primary school education and develop a very, wide base of education or what have you, and then slowly secondary education. This is just one example in the education field. And, in the early 60s, there were still only several thousand people attending secondary schools in administration-run schools in Papua New Guinea. And for the UN, this was far too slow. There need to be, there's 5 million people in PNG at this time. There should be more people at high school, according to these people. So his view was that it should happen slowly, should happen stably. And he's informed by what happened in places like Australia as well. I think that's the important part of this, that Australians are looking at what's happening in poorer parts of the world, in Africa or Southeast Asia, but they're also looking about how Australia developed, and there are institutions that people at HASLAC see that worked there, whether it's court systems, financial systems, political systems, whatever they might be, and they would encourage them in PNG. So there's this kind of idea, there's a model that's being constructed, and it's informed by how Australia has operated over time, whether it's farmers selling their goods on a market. I mean, Australia, for many, many years, that was how Australia became rich, by selling, whether it was minerals or wool or wheat or what have you. And a lot of Australians were like, well, let's try and duplicate that in PNG, with not always, the results that were expected. But that is a broad vision of development at that time, which Australia is borrowing from, looking at what's happening in British examples, but also what the United States are doing. This idea of, if we spend lots of money, if we invest in this place, it will start to generate its own economic growth, and that will be, a good thing that will be done. Yeah.
And so do you think this sort of idea of improving the local population standard of living through creating industries that can feed them and provide export goods, bring in income, that was a priority for HASLAC as well? Or was it sort of just really basically fostering development of a territory that would, if you followed the trajectory of Australia, take a century or so to come to sort of full level of development?
So I think that there was definitely a recognition that it was unlikely, for instance, that, the living standards in PNG would catch up to those in Australia if at all, but in a short space of time. But I think that the way development was understood was that because countries like Australia and the United States had gone through their process of development, yes, it had taken decades, centuries, however long you want to sort of think through, that because we understood that process, that, how a country or a society modernises, that it could be done more quickly, that if we've sort of cracked that code.
There were some shortcuts.
This was the assumption at the time, that with the financial resources, but also advice coming from Australian and American and so on experts, that rather than having to spend decades working out what the best agricultural method would be, for instance, or how to set up an education system, you could do it in several years. And so there was, while acknowledging that it would take time, there was a sense that it could happen more quickly with the advice of the so-called developed, knowledge, than the way that it happened in the past. So it's a little bit of both. I think there's a little bit of recognising that it will take a long time, but also that it can happen faster than perhaps without that help. Yeah.
I mean, an interesting thing to consider in terms of Australia's development is, we had our own unique culture. So while we were importing institutions from Britain, we were changing them a little to suit Australia as it was a series of colonies. But were there sensitivities around Papua New Guinean culture and how they did things? Because they have, hundreds of tribes. It's a very diverse population, quite obviously poor levels of educational attainment, but they had sort of ways of negotiating conflict and governance that would have been incredibly different to what Australia was proposing.
Yeah, this is one of the fundamental issues with development as a phenomenon, particularly in the middle part of the 20th century, that there was an expectation at the time amongst the sort of people providing the aid or development assistance that certain cultural traits, behaviours and so on would fall by the wayside and be replaced by modern ways of thinking, which often aligned with Western ways of thinking. So certain practices to do with treatment of women or ways of resolving tribal conflict or something like that, they were looked upon by Australian officials as something that often needed to be abolished and changed and replaced with what might be more familiar to us in Australia. That both reflects the attitude of the time, development thinking of the time. It also, I think, in some ways limited the effectiveness of implementing those things because it, requires, for instance, English becomes a language that is spoken in PNG, or Tok Pisin, which is sort of Pidgin, that's the more common language that's spoken there. But there are 800 languages spoken in PNG, and by trying to sort of force everyone or impose a, monolingual system, it requires people to think about their ways of living in different ways that may not actually sort of speed up what you're trying to do. If there had been increased recognition of perhaps the local ways of doing things, not all of them, but there might have been a more, in the long run, it may have had more of an effect, but at the same time, the thinking was this had to happen sooner, had to happen quickly. Nowadays, development thinking is much more in line with sort of having a much clearer understanding of local needs, local understandings. So there has been an evolution in the last 70 years. But in the Hasluck period, which we're talking about, which was sort of the 50s into the early 60s, that was far less prominent. One area where it was often protected was in terms of land rights, that it was often, in contrast with what happened in Australia, for instance, where obviously dispossession of Indigenous land is, a big part of the story, that local ownership of land was often maintained. And so that has had...
And then documented?
Yes, yeah, for the most part.
Yeah.
There are still communal questions there. The status of infrastructure in PNG is in 2025 still sometimes difficult to follow. But in contrast, so for instance, if setting up a plantation, a coconut plantation or a coffee plantation or what have you, if an Australian person wanted to start that, they were not able to just take the land, that they would often be held in lease to the local population. So that was seen as a sort of acknowledgement of, in the long run, this country will be independent in its own right and it will need to sort of maintain control of its own territory and so on. So there was some recognition, but I think in terms of cultural practices, there was often disregard paid by the Australian officials, more often than not.
I think something that's interesting to consider in the context of the early trusteeship arrangement is that Australia didn't necessarily see itself as an equal to the UK or the US in terms of levels of development, of economic development, even sort of institutional development. We only had 8 universities at that stage. We didn't have the capacity to educate such a large quantity of people, certainly not as we do today. I mean, how does this play out? How does Australia view itself in the 50s, and how does it, I guess, maximise the opportunities from being considered not quite fully developed?
So I think
it's hard to imagine that Australia is not an OECD country.
Yes, that's right.
Today.
And so it manifests in a variety of different ways. And I'm still working on this question because I don't think I'll ever it's one of those, lifelong things we're still working through. A good example to think through would be something like the Snowy Mountain Scheme, which is a big project built in the sort of 40s through to the 70s, which is seen as this, the phrase nation building is kind of a synonym for underdeveloped inside. Like that Australia was still kind of developing its own economic system and political system. Parliament, Canberra,
Reserve Bank, Canberra, our capital, a lot of institute, National Library.
That's right.
And the Mint.
but also even things like industrialisation. A country like Australia would look at the United States with its huge factories, huge industrialised areas, and think that's something to aspire towards. And that's reflected in what happens in the 50s and 60s with the opening of, car manufacturing. And that is the symbols of what it is to be an industrialised country is a big part of it. Where it becomes complicated is that I think sometimes, particularly today, we probably associate status of development with wealth. And Australia, even at this time, is still one of the richest countries in the world. It's just what it sells to the rest of the world is different to what a country like the United States is selling to the rest of the world. And so I think that is where it becomes awkward for outward-looking society. So Australia might go to the UN in the 1960s and say, we're not quite developed like the United States, but the Indian representative will say, yeah, but you're as rich as them and we're really poor. So, it's a bit on the nose to say that you're kind of like us sort of thing. But there was definitely a perception amongst, I think John McEwen is a really good example of this, who was Minister for Trade under Menzies and briefly Prime Minister, that he, looking at it from an agricultural perspective, thought there was many ways to improve, in those words at the time, whether it's better machinery and all that kind of thing, to sort of develop Australia. And I think we still see that in some ways today. There is a certain, I don't know if inferiority complex is the right word, but I think there is often a sense of looking out to, the big sort of US, UK, that Australia still sees itself as kind of trying to catch up to these places. I don't know. That's I'm a historian looking back in the day.
I wonder if it's to do with our level of industrialisation, that we really were a farm gate
that's right.
economy back then. I mean, we still have a huge amount of our exports are agricultural.
Yeah.
I mean, even today we're sort of criticised for having a lack of diversity of economic activity. We're really around agriculture and mining.
That's right.
And then, a bit of education and then tourism, and you're sort of starting to drip away. Whereas you go to the United States and they've got masses of different industries, and if one's failing, another will rise up. And so in terms of our level of economic sophistication and industrialisation, we did seem underdeveloped.
Yeah.
I mean, Douglas Copeland, and there's obviously a good strong Melbourne University link here, he coined this term milk bar economy. Can you explain milk bar economy?
He was always good for a quote, Copeland. But so I don't want to sort of think that he just thought that the Australian economy was sort of defined by, a milk bar in every corner and all that. That's not what he was referring to, although there probably was a milk bar in most corners back then. But what he was really interested and sort of goes to the point that you were just making there, Georgina, that the nature of the Australian economy was, according to Copeland, relatively unsophisticated. Let's use that word unsophisticated. That Australia was very focused on making consumer products to support this high standard of living, and that actually was quite a flimsy base on which to create an economy, that there needed to be this much stronger manufacturing industrialised sort of base. And for him, he thought that Australia should invest more in these kinds of things, that Australia's development wasn't complete until it had managed to achieve those sorts of things. And he was actually quite critical throughout his career. I don't think he ever thought it got beyond that sort of status. And his phrase of the milk bar economy sort of reflected that, typifying Australians as these people with their consumer goods, whether it's their cars or their newfangled, refrigerators and so on, TVs and so on in the 50s and 60s, that wasn't enough to base an economy on. And I'm not sure, he might look at today's economy and probably recognise similar sort of parts. But that's really what he's getting at, that Australia needed to kind of do more to develop its own manufacturing industries and heavy manufacturing. This was like making machinery and so on, rather than buying it from the US or what have you. Yeah.
And then this, I guess, debate then leads into the question about how comfortable Australia was to spend money on other territories. Yeah. So we had a lot of focus on our own development, universities, snowy hydro you spoke of, all manner of really important things for Australia. But then we were spending money on Nauru and New Guinea.
Yeah.
And yes, they were territories, they weren't independent countries. As our development budget these days is spending money on the fortunes of other independent countries. But still, there must have been a concern in some parts of the population that money should be spent on Australians, not on people in other parts of the world.
And I mean, this is a critique of foreign aid that it has existed since it began and continues to exist today, that every dollar spent on building a school in Port Moresby or a school in a part of rural India or something like that is a dollar that's not spent on certain resources in Australia. But particularly in that middle part of the 20th century, that while Australia was spending large amounts of money on its own development, there were quite a few people who felt that some of that money would be better spent in Australia. That being said, that while, in the scheme of things for PNG, a grant in the mid-50s in the £5 to £10 million range was a lot of money in PNG. It was actually quite a small amount in the sort of overall budget of Australia. So I think comparatively, Australia could afford it, but I think there were quite a few people who made the claim that, question priorities in some ways and question the level of it. And it reaches a height in the sort of mid to late 60s, and then it starts to decline as Australia's economic fortunes sort of declined a little bit in the 1970s. So there is a correspondence between when there's boom, aid can kind of go up, and when there's a sort of a decline in economic fortunes, aid is often an early target. Yeah.
Now, we skipped ahead a bit to talk about Hasluck as Minister for the Territories, but prior to Hasluck, of course, we had Eddie Ward. And, I mean, Eddie Ward's quite an interesting political figure.
To use.
Anyway, I mean, he comes up with this, I think, allegation that when Menzies was Prime Minister in the first part of World War II, 39 to 41, that there's this Brisbane line and that Menzies is going to allow Australia to be invaded up to Brisbane and then defend sort of from Brisbane and below. There's absolutely no substance to it, but it catches on anyway. He's sort of known as that firebrand Eddie Ward. He's controversial, but he has a particular interest in Papua New Guinea and wants this New Deal, which is not without controversy.
No. And so Eddie Ward, I mean, he's appointed Minister for External Affairs, or External Territories, should I say. It's renamed Territories after the Menzies government comes into power. So he's responsible only for New Guinea or Papua New Guinea and Nauru. But he's also responsible for transport. And there's he's always another person really great for a quote, Eddie Ward. But he sort of made a comment about how, as Minister for Transport, the Army was in control of the transport and the Japanese were in control of the territory. So it didn't have a lot to do during the Second World War. But once the war ends, as part of there is a recognition of the work that Indigenous New Guinean population did during the Second World War. That I mean, the legend of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angel. If we've got Anzac from World War I, it's Kokoda. It's that in the Second World War. And as part of that, there is a sort of acknowledgement amongst the Labor government at the time under Chifley that there needs to be increased investment in Papua New Guinea. And so this New Deal is formed. The phrasing of New Deal is not an accident. If we think of American history, you've got the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt from the 1930s onwards. So it is this kind of acknowledgement that there is a role for the government to play in sort of motivating investment and all this kind of thing, that prior to the Second World War, PNG was almost left to kind of pay for itself in a way, that there wasn't a lot of money. It was tens of thousands of pounds, which is a drop in the bucket. Very quickly from the post-Second World War period onward, it goes up quite quickly. And Ward sort of kicks it off, but it is this fairly ad hoc. Whereas we talked about before, Hasluck having this sort of vision of what development should look like, under Ward it's much more sort of, it aligns with political positions and so on. He's a avowed socialist and so on. So he's advocating for that. And
then it has, I guess, a link to the economic orthodoxy of the period, the Keynesian economics, this sort of government control, government funding of projects to really stimulate economic activity.
Yeah, and that's exactly, and the Labor government in particular, and I think, the Menzies government also were Keynesian sort of thinkers. That was the orthodoxy at the time, as you say. But particularly under the Labor government, there was a clear recognition that the government was going to be the group that would sort of spur on the investment. And that really kickstarts the investment. And it sort of takes on a slightly different tone under the Hasluck period. But in many ways, he also continues on the New Deal ideas of Australian sort of government investment in New Guinean development and what that might look like. The targets might change slightly under those different governments. But I mean, the other part of what dominates the Ward period is also just rebuilding from the Second World War, that New Guinea is devastated by the fighting. And so they're not just starting from an earlier stage of development, but they're also literally rebuilding from, fighting the Second World War. Yeah.
A key feature of Australia's international development policy during the Menzies era is, of course, the Colombo Plan.
Yeah.
And we've done lots on the Colombo Plan, as you can imagine, here at the Robert Menzies Institute with David Lowe and others. I mean, it lives and breathes again, and a new iteration today is a new Colombo Plan, sort of reverse version where Australian students go out to the region. But is there an argument that the Colombo Plan is a successor to Eddie Ward's New Deal for PNG, or is it isn't the I think it's sort of apocryphal, but Spender comes up with it on a plane on the way to a meeting with Suharto and writes it's sort of almost Stephen Conroy-esque around the NBN, on the back of a paper napkin or something.
Yes. So these plans often have quite a lot of sort of mythology surrounding them. Spender was very good at promoting his own, he wrote a lot of, as I'm sure you're all aware here, but there's also the story of him wanting it to be called the Spender Plan, which is the worst possible name for a foreign aid program that you can possibly think of.
It's like being called Dr. Butcher when you're a surgeon.
Exactly. But there are definitely connections. Whether it's a successor or not, I think is one way to think about it. But I think one of the points I, again, make in my book is that we need to look at these two sort of areas as connected, whereas I think sometimes they're looked at separately. And it comes to this idea of Australian resources and expertise being used to assist its regional neighbours to develop. So whereas you've got the New Deal and the Hasluck period in PNG as an example of Australians spending millions of pounds on improving the sort of welfare of people who live in PNG. The Colombo Plan had more or less the same developmental objectives in places like India, Pakistan, other parts of Southeast Asia. But of course, the Colombo Plan is a much broader organisation. It involves other countries. I think another important difference with the Colombo Plan and PNG is the Cold War and the place. We haven't really talked about the Cold War very much in this conversation. The Colombo Plan is partly motivated to stop Soviet kind of influence in South and Southeast Asia. I think there's less concern over that in PNG, but at the same time, that ideology of development and expertise and resources, I think suggests that where some people, I don't think this is really an argument that gets made anymore, but this idea that Australian aid begins with the Colombo Plan sort of leaves off PNG, which today is still our largest aid recipient. And yes, there are colonial roots. The fact that, in the 1960s, there were international efforts to sort of push countries to give 1% of their GNP as aid. Australia always counted its colonial assistance to PNG as foreign aid rather than as something different, which I think is a little bit of creative kind of accounting in a way, but it suggests that Australians saw what it was doing in PNG as having a similar kind of heritage to what they were doing in the Colombo Plan, for instance. So there's definitely connections. There's also important differences, but yeah, 100%.
How do you think Australians viewed New Guinea prior to independence? Did they? I mean, I have an uncle, for example, who spent time there in the early 70s working as a journalist, and he speaks really fondly of that time. As a lot of Australians there, as you can imagine. I mean, it seemed like it was sort of home, like it was part of Australia. Yet, obviously, the New Guineans had a very different perspective.
It's there is a generation of people probably that sort of correspond with who you speak to that have a PNG connection, whether it's a relative that was born there, a relative that lived there for a short period of time, working in the administration or working as a journalist, or maybe having a religious, like the missionary, the major religious connections as well. And so I think at the time there was definitely a perception that this place was connected to Australia. Well, this part of Australia I don't think the everyday Australians saw Papua New Guinea as an equivalent to a state or Northern Territory. Maybe connection to Northern Territory might be a more interesting sort of point to make. But I think that's about where it ended. I think it would be going way too far to suggest that Australians were deeply engaged with, the promotion of development in Papua New Guinea. But I think that's a similar kind of story for Australian politics in general, to suggest that Australians are kind of, reading the ins and outs of Australian policy. I don't think that is how Australians sort of engage with political life necessarily. The other part, of course, is you had a lot of Australians who fought in the Second World War in New Guinea, so they would have come home and they would have that connection to New Guinea. But then when it comes to actively engaging with the nature of that colonial rule, I think it was looked at relatively with a degree of ambivalence in the 50s and 60s. By the 60s, I think there is a growing sort of sense, and I think you can connect this to challenges to, the place of Indigenous people in Australia, white Australia, the broader sort of social and cultural change that's happening in Australia. PNG gets wrapped into that with, the Whitlam government, or what becomes the Whitlam government, kind of suggesting that Australia shouldn't have a colonial administration anymore. University students, protesting Vietnam, but also saying that what we do in PNG is sort of wrong. But I think in an earlier period, in the sort of 50s and 60s, I think it was much more an ambivalent attitude towards it. There was sort of a small scale sort of thing. That's, how I would see it. Yeah.
Gough Whitlam is obviously, as opposition leader in the late 60s, obviously very early 70s. In terms of foreign policy, he's very ambitious. He, goes to China very famously. He also goes to Papua New Guinea. Yeah. And then when he's elected, basically it's the path to independence, and that's effected on the 16th of September 1975, just under 2 months to go till that was the end of Gough Whitlam, at least his government. So, I mean, there's, I guess, an argument that perhaps it was too sudden and that it left Papua New Guinea in, at risk of failure. And, it's no secret that its development journey since independence and prior, of course, but since independence has been a very difficult one. And you can only look at all the sort of UN Millennium Development Goals and it fails on many, many of those. The situation with women, for children is still pretty bad by global standards. economic development it's still a very poor country. And this is despite the fact it is the number one destination for Australian aid dollars and has been, has always been.
Yep.
And you look at other aid recipient countries, Australia has focused on Indonesia and I think Thailand. I mean, these are basically developed countries now. So their journey has been very different. Was independence too quick? I guess is the first question. I could ask more, but I think
question is that, I mean, there are people in Papua New Guinea today who would suggest that was the case. Not everyone. I think that one of the big divisions that existed at the time it actually continues to exist in Papua New Guinea is between the sort of the coastal regions and the highlands regions in PNG. And one of the big divisions there is the length of time that these places are exposed to Australian rule. Port Moresby is on the southern coast. There are parts of northern New Guinea and the islands that, were the earliest colonised. And the people who lived in those parts of PNG were quite active in sort of pushing for independence as soon as possible. They had increased engagement with ideas that were coming from parts of Africa and this is after most African countries had gained their independence. And so that group of people would look at PNG today and say there is no such thing as too soon, that we are Papua New Guinean and it is wrong for the Australians to be in charge of us. On the flip side, there were people in the Highlands, and there are parts of the Highlands region that there was no encounter between Australian rule and Highlands people until the mid-1960s. So until that time, there was no colonial encounter, which is very late in global history for, a part of the world to be opened up to the rest of the world. And so for these people, they had just been exposed to this world of nation states and development and all this sort of stuff. And suddenly they're being told in less than 10 years you are going to be in charge of your own affairs and you're going to be a modern nation state in the UN, in all these kinds of things. And a lot of these people are like, whoa, let's slow down. We have not had the same opportunities as people in the coastal regions. And so it's a big debate within Papua New Guinea, amongst Papua New Guineans in that sort of 5 years leading up to independence. And so that's the sort of tension, and I don't think that tension has gone away. And I think that division within PNG between Highlands, and there's all sorts of cultural differences that come about with that. There's also the fact that the population in the Highlands was about 4 times higher than Australians actually thought it was. And so suddenly this population that was about 3 million people suddenly doubled. And what do we do? So that's all happening while Australia is saying, we don't want to be in charge of you anymore. And so I think part of it is that division. I think that also part of it is there's inconsistency on Australia's part. We talked before about Hasluck, this sort of gradual, slow, and then suddenly Whitlam comes around and it's like, click your fingers and you're going to be independent in 5 years. That lack of consistency, I think, while not creating all of the problems, I think that it would be wrong to say that was the key issue, but it did lead to a haste in creating certain institutions and so on that may not have been as set as they might have otherwise been if policy had remained consistent over the 30 years.
Obviously, there were advocates for independence 100%. In Papua New Guinea, that's without question. But was there a sense of abandonment by Australia?
Yes and no. I think that so
because the Australian officials, they left,
yes,
didn't they?
Yeah. So there were commitments to financially the resources given to PNG by Australia were more or less continued after independence. That it just went from being a colonial grant to being foreign aid. So, and in a rare case for Australia, it was actively just budget support. So Australia would give PNG hundreds of millions of dollars and this is now part of your budget kind of thing. But more broadly, there was a perception of some would have seen it as abandonment, some would have seen it as a suggestion that you are ready to go. And I think, again, it's that classic, it depends on where you were in PNG, it depends on what your role was. There were some parts that felt they were more ready than others. But even today, there is still that sense of close connection on the part of Papua New Guineans towards Australia. I was in PNG in 2023 and talking to them. They have a clear sense of the place of Australia in their lives. They all have their state of origin team and all this kind of thing.
They're getting their own, aren't they?
They're getting their own team, yes. This is, it's a fascinating example of aid. Whereas I think if you asked Australians what they see as Papua New Guinea today, I think you'd get a lot of people that might talk about rugby league. They've got some good rugby league players that come from there.
Do you know that my observation is it's similar, the US vis-a-vis Australia?
Yeah.
We spend a lot of time in Australia as the little country, its population, economically, a range of factors, thinking and talking about the US.
Yeah.
US is absolutely not thinking and
much.
talking about us much at all.
Particularly not anymore. And so I think that's a really important part. And whether that's to do with, power imbalances or just, that kind of thing, I think that perception was certainly there in the 70s as well. There was certainly people that sort of felt more advice could be given. There were others that sort of, we want to have a chance to go on our own. I think you can also talk about hindsight being a thing, people looking back 50 years later and saying, if they'd stayed for another 5 years, what might have happened? But as a historian, I know that question has no answer. Would there have been a civil war if Australia had stayed? Would there have been an armed resistance? I don't know. We can't sort of say these sorts of things. So,
Nick Ferns, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I have 20, 30 more questions I wanted to ask, but time is upon us. Thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.